Richard Mayne presents a documentary portrait of this century's leading figure in French culture.
Pauvre roi supplicié des ombres, regarde ton peuple d'ombre se lever dans la nuit de juin constellée de tortures. Voici le fracas des chars allemands qui remontent vers la Normandie à travers les longues plaintes des bestiaux réveillés. Grâce à toi, les chars n'arriveront pas à temps.
The voice of the late André Malraux, adventurer, novelist, man of action, aesthete and statesman, on a cold December day in 1964 in the Place du Panthéon in Paris. In the background, a funeral march by the Belgian composer François-Joseph Gossec, which Malraux himself had unearthed. He was there to commemorate the wartime resistance hero Jean Moulin, tortured to death by the Nazis.
Poor agonizing king of shadows, see your people of shadows rise in that June night, alive with torture. Hear the rumble of the German tanks heading for Normandy amid the lowing of cattle awakened from sleep. Because of you, those tanks will arrive too late. And when the Allies break through, see commissioners of the Republic come forward in all the towns of France.
La trouée des Alliés commence. Regarde, préfet, surgir dans toutes les villes de France les commissaires de la République.
Today, André Malraux's voice survives only in recordings. He died in 1976, aged 75. But his name is still very much alive. No other writer of the 20th century, says the Mexican novelist Carlos Fuentes, had the same capacity to translate his personal adventure into a meeting with history and a dialogue of civilization. The University of Chicago Press has just reissued 3 of Malraux's lesser-known books. And in Paris, not long ago, the bookshops were full of a selection of writings by Napoleon Bonaparte that Malraux had compiled almost anonymously in 1930. Together they made up a kind of Napoleonic autobiography, Vie de Napoléon par lui-même. Like many French books, this one carried a red publicity band to attract attention. On it, in big white letters, was one single name. Bonaparte? Napoleon? No, Malraux. For the reading public, he was obviously a bigger draw than the emperor himself. And, like Napoleon, he is still both admired and condemned.
I cannot name one person, left, right, or centre, who was not really fascinated by the man.
He was in love with danger, with adventure, with the daring attitude. He was a man of challenge,
He didn't do 1/3 of a quarter of what he said he had done, both in China and in Spain, let alone in the resistance. He was a fake. He was a fake.
Sometimes for him, imagination can become a kind of experience. That's perhaps the answer.
He had to forge a sort of mask, and he needed that.
He's the one great epic novelist of the revolution to come, which never came.
Since I know that the tales he tells are just tales, I'm not so interested anymore. I find them naff. I don't like the way they're written. It's another thing. I don't like that style.
I still believe that he is one of the 7 or 10 very important writers of Between the Wars.
So French opinions about Malraux are still sharply divided, on his life and on his work. Was he a fake or a crook? He certainly went treasure hunting in Cambodia illegally at the age of 21. But he was also the champion of colonial peoples when he later ran a left-wing newspaper in Saigon. He exaggerated his supposed role in the Chinese Revolution, the struggle on which he based 2 novels, including Man's Estate, La Condition Humaine, which won the Goncourt Prize in 1933. In the Spanish Civil War against Franco, he organized and flew in the España Air Squadron, which figured later in his novel and film L'Espoir, Days of Hope. But then in World War II, Why was he so slow to join the French resistance? He eventually played a leading part in it, and later became a friend and minister to General de Gaulle. As de Gaulle's Minister of Culture, did Malraux leave a lasting legacy? And what value will posterity place on his voluminous writings about art? The biographer Jean Lacouture called Malraux's life a life in the century. Malraux said that for him the 20th century was like a lorry bristling with rifles. Was there, as some suggested, an element of posturing, standing up against the skyline of historic events? Personally, I've long been perplexed by André Malraux, puzzled by the contrast between the man and what Jean-Yves Tadier, one of his editors, called his mask a moment ago. I only saw him towards the end of his life, when he used to appear at General de Gaulle's press conferences. I put it to Jean Lacouture that Malraux in those days looked like some great medieval abbot, possibly unfrocked.
Yes, yes, he has the face of an heretic priest. Could be a great heretic. I think the man who invented great heresies could have the same face and the same passion and the same troubles in the face and the same movement in the face and the same haunted face, yes.
Though others, like Malraux's young friend and disciple Olivier Germain-Thomas, saw him more intimate and relaxed.
When we look at his face attentively, we saw in his eyes and his smile, we saw a very great goodness and a very great humanity. Certainly, especially when he was smiling. Not very often, but sometimes he was smiling and he was becoming like a child.
So there's disagreement even about what he looked like. But on one point, everyone who knew him agrees completely. He talked a blue streak. It was in the great Louvre Museum, discussing works of art, that Malraux was at his most unstoppable. And it was there that Pierre Rosenberg, now head of its paintings department, first encountered that verbal dynamo.
I think I met him in the museum as I was a young conservateur, and he was impressive. He was impressive first because he had the gestures which were not of the common nature in a certain way. Secondly, because the words, this fact of speaking without interruption and not being able to follow the words. He spoke too quickly in a certain way to follow the images, and you thought, well, is this meaning something or not?
Si, bien sûr. Bien sûr. Quand il s'agit d'un homme comme Picasso, le fait que vous ayez la continuité d'une vie est le système de référence à quoi se réfère l'œuvre, quelle qu'elle soit. C'est-à-dire un Picasso, je mets à part la période rose et la période bleue, à partir de la période maigre, un Picasso se réfère à la totalité de l'œuvre de Picasso. Donc, quand on a une quasi-totalité comme ici, il y a un phénomène qu'on ne retrouvera pas.
Suddenly, in this torrent of words, you found a sort of diamond, in a certain way, of a clarity, and you were hoping not to forget it.
But then again, Pierre Rosenberg couldn't actually remember any particular example. And when the reporter and novelist Olivier Todd went to see Malraux, the torrent of words was just as fascinating. But it was hard to distinguish between the diamonds and the paste.
I met him in Verrières-le-Buisson, and I must say I was very suspicious, and I immediately fell under the charm. And then he showed me a black cat, and he said with this extraordinary accent, "Vous savez, quand cette chatte entend le mot mort, elle s'en va." And of course on the word mort, death, the cat ran away. And then he talked for, I don't know, about 2 hours about everything under the sun, sometimes producing these prophetic sentences which one finds extremely difficult to understand. One was, we talked about Stalinism, and he said once more, shivering as he did, his voice shivering and broken, Stalinism. Le stalinisme, c'est la statistique. Stalinism is statistics. Now, what the hell does that mean? He also was extraordinarily moving when we talked about Sartre. Sartre, Aragon, and Malraux had just signed one of these petitions, of which we're so fond of in France, to Franco to save 3 Basques. And I said, how come that you are so distant now? You know, you have nothing in common with Aragon, nothing in common with Sartre. How come you signed that? And I also remember what he said. He said, c'est de l'ordre des constellations. That has something to do with the movement of constellations. You know, not humble, huh? Not humble at all. And I also remember that when I had my interview deciphered, I couldn't make head or tails of it. So, as we used to say in journalism, I put it together. In other words, I rewrote it. I'd asked him whether he wanted to see the interview. He said no, and he sent me a very charming letter. So he said, my putting a bit of order in that mess. And he also, somebody's stolen the book, and I'm very angry. He dedicated Ode de Passage to me, and it said to Olivier Todd, his accomplice, Malraux, because he knew that an interview was part complicity. In other words, I went there very suspicious, and I came out totally charmed.
When Malraux called Olivier Todd his accomplice, Todd was in good company. Malraux had written a similar dedication to the Oxford professor Isaiah Berlin. But then Malraux had always been charming. His very first book, published when he was only 20, had the fragile, playful grace of dandyish paradox. Its title was Paper Moons, Lunes en Papier, and it was very much in the brittle idiom of Paris, 1921.
Dotty Town was celebrating. Its queen, Death, was languishing, and had said that she wanted the town's doctors to meet as soon as possible to vote for which of them they thought worthy to be allowed to treat her ladyship.
Weird, prankish Toy Town stuff from a writer who was soon to be known as a veteran man of action. Yet another contradiction, or so it seems. But, of course, Malraux had begun adult life in the hothouse of the Paris book world, dealing in rare volumes, and even in those erotic items that used to be known as curious. As he told his first wife, Clara, without her, he might have remained a bookworm, or a library rat, un rat de bibliothèque. Instead, when he was still only 21, they both set out on a strange and hazardous adventure. Having lost a good deal of money in an overseas investment, they decided to combine business and pleasure by travelling to Cambodia in search of lost art treasures. They unearthed a few, but were arrested, and Malraux was convicted, though after organised protests, his sentence was eventually suspended. Amateur archaeology or simple looting? Olivier Todd is in two minds.
If you are legal-minded, you have to admit that it was absolutely shocking. He went there with his wife, Clara, and a friend, and they had decided that they would pick a few statues and sell them probably to American art dealers and collectioners and live for 3 or 4 years. Now, put it in perspective. Was he more guilty in stealing these statues, which he unquestionably did, or were the rather backward colonialists, not all of them, but many of them, more guilty of exploiting the Indo-Chinese and refusing reforms? I won't argue, as his lawyer did in Saigon, that one did not know to whom the territory really belonged. I think that whoever it belonged to, it was theft. There's no doubt about it. What I do know is that if Malraux had not gone on this Indo-Chinese, more exactly Cambodian expedition, he would not have discovered the horrors of colonialism in French Indochina. He would not have written Les Conquérants, and then after that La Condition Humaine, not to mention La Voie Royale, where his expedition is somewhat embellished. And we wouldn't have had the revolutionary writer that we did have, and we wouldn't have had the newspaper which he created in Saigon. So on the whole, I think history will forgive him for this little adventure.
Would Chen try to lift up the mosquito net? Would he strike his blow through it? Anxiety twisted his stomach. He knew he was tough, but for the moment he felt only dazed, fascinated by this mass of white muslin that hung from the ceiling over a body that was barely a shadow, with only a foot sticking out half sideways in sleep, but alive nevertheless. The flesh of a man.
The famous opening scene from Man's Estate, La Condition Humaine, with an assassin steeling himself to kill. With two other novels, The Conquerors and La Voie Royale, The Royal Road, this was the main literary fruit of Malraux's Asian adventures, a fast-moving tale about the uneasy alliance of two Chinese revolutionary forces, the Communist Party and Chiang Kai-shek's Kuomintang. For some people, it remains Malraux's best novel, still worthy of its 1933 Goncourt Prize. But there are Frenchmen today who think it's overrated. The writer and journalist Jean-François Revel, for instance.
All of a sudden, after the war, I don't know, his novels seemed to me to have no literary value whatsoever. And even sometimes grotesque, for instance, at the beginning of the Condition Humaine, there is the conversation between a man and a woman and philosophizing and saying, didn't you notice that one makes love more often during revolutionary periods, for instance, which seems something extraordinarily subtle and interesting when you're 14 years old, but later it's a little naive, you see.
Myself, I find that judgment harsh. Page after page of Man's Estate seems to me to refute it. Take the suicide of one of its central characters, avoiding a worse death at the hands of his captors.
Now he held the cyanide in his hand. He had often wondered whether it would be easy to die. He knew that if he decided to kill himself, he would kill himself. But knowing the cruel indifference with which life unmasks us to ourselves, he had worried about that moment when death would utterly crush his consciousness forever. No, dying could be a noble act, the supreme expression of a life that it so much resembled, and it would mean escaping the two soldiers who were hesitantly approaching. He crushed the poison between his teeth as if obeying his own order. He heard Katov question him again, anxiously reaching out to touch him, and just when he wanted to cling to him, suffocating, he felt all his strength desert him, torn to pieces in one mighty convulsion.
Reading Man's Estate, I can only marvel at the power of Malraux's imagination. But sometimes that power could lead him into myth-making. His biographer, Jean Lacouture, who's normally very sympathetic to Malraux, has no patience with that.
He was fake in certain respects, especially about China, for example. He told many stories, many lies about his role in China. After all, in the first book, Les Conquérants, in the forewords, he says that he was a political commissioner in Canton during the revolt, the uprising in Canton. That was perfectly wrong. He was not.
Malraux told the same story to the American critic Edmund Wilson, though some people doubt whether he ever spent much time on the Chinese mainland. But as a writer, he could be immensely convincing. He misled even an old China hand, Jean Fontenoy, the editor of the Journal de Shanghai.
I do not know André Malraux, but I have reason to suppose that he took part in this whole Cantonese affair. It is naturally very difficult to determine in a work of this kind how much is imagined and how much is remembered.
Or, as Malraux's first wife Clara asked, more severely, where did dreams end for my companion? Where did reality begin? One day he said to me, I tell lies, but my lies turn into the truth. Whatever the literal truth about Malraux's Eastern adventures, he certainly played an active and courageous part on the Republican side in the Spanish Civil War. He not only raised money to fight against Franco, organized a rudimentary air squadron, and worked with the communists, who seemed to him the most effective of his colleagues. He also flew on combat missions himself.
He did spend 7 months in Spain, that he created the Spanish fleet on the Republican side, which was not part of the international brigades. He had 6, 7, 8, 9 planes, I forget. and he actually fought. He knew nothing, this colonel, so-called colonel, knew nothing about weapons, hadn't even done his military service, but he did fly and organize these people. And the character of Magnin in Man's Hope, who after all is partly Malraux, is something that none of us can forget. And even if we do know that the Spanish Civil War was much more complicated, and even if people like Orwell and Hugh Thomas have thrown extraordinary light on the Spanish Civil War, I know that when I happened to reread one of the descriptions of this small band of brothers attacking the Moor columns in, I think, the Battle of Teruel, one is deeply moved, and one feels that there, Malraux, although his political attitude can be questioned in the sense that he was more Stalinist than Republican, one does feel that here was a man who actually, to use this ghastly word, committed himself fully, actually did risk his life.
The rev counter dropped from 1,200 to 1,100. The plane was losing height by a meter every second. Below them were the spurs of the snow mountain. If they fell into the ravines, they would be crushed like a drunken wasp against a wall. Beyond, there were broad, undulating stretches of snow. And what was underneath them? They went through a cloud. In the absolute whiteness, the whole floor of the fuselage was stained with footprints in blood. Pujol tried to climb out of the cloud, but their fall took them through it. They were now 60 meters above the mountain. The ground was rushing up at them, but those soft snowbanks. They longed to escape, now that they'd dropped all but one of their bombs and dodged the anti-aircraft fire. "The bomb!" shouted Gautet. If they didn't offload it now, they'd all be blown to pieces. Saidi forced down both release levers at once, breaking them. The bomb fell, and as if it had hurled the ground against the plane, they were showered in snow.
It's rooted in reality. And Malraux was a man of imagination, of course, but he was too a man of facts. He was a man in life. He was an actor. He was a man who was doing something. And the doing is inspiring for his writings. He's a poet, but in the same time, he's a poet of action. And in Hope, in l'Espoir, action is very present. He's emerge in action, and that makes his art great.
3 fascists had just taken 3 prisoners. They led them to the ditch and stepped back. "Take aim." The prisoner on the left had a pudding basin haircut. The 3 bodies, unusually tall, towered over those who were looking at them and were silhouetted against the famous horizon of the Tagus Mountains. How little history matters in the face of living flesh, still living. They jumped recklessly backwards. The squad fired, but the prisoners were already in the ditch. How could they hope to escape? The other prisoners laughed nervously. They had not escaped. The onlookers had seen them jump first, but the squad had already fired. As the music deadened his willpower, it gave all its strength to the past. He had been born for war, born for the responsibility of death. Like a sleepwalker who suddenly wakes up on the edge of a roof, these grave descending notes filled his mind with awareness of his fearful equilibrium, from which he could only fall into blood.
That elegiac tone comes from near the end of Days of Hope, L'Espoir. By then, in fact, hope of defeating Franco was beginning to fade. But the book had begun in an excited, staccato fashion, with the crackle of telephone contacts among the Republican units. It was a little like Saint-Exupéry's aviation stories, and very like a film. And, of course, Malraux did base his film, L'Espoir, on 2 episodes in his novel. The film critic Michel Ciment sees it as a landmark in cinema history.
Well, of course,
L'Espoir is quite an astonishing film, and I think the fact that it was made in 1939 and only shown in 1945 hurt it a little in its place in film history, because though it's the only film made by Malraux, it is in a way quite an experimental film and a forerunner of Italian neorealism. And it has this quality of the great Italian neorealist films like Rome, Open City or Paisa, of though some of it is staged and they are professional actors, still it is shot in a raw, realistic style, on the spur of the action, and it has the kind of authenticity that you find in some great war photographs of Robert Capa, for instance, this kind of moment preserved of great intensity. There are movements at the end of L'Espoir, with this long line of serpentine, reminds us, of course, of some shots of Soviet cinema, and in a way anticipates Eisenstein's Ivan the Terrible, because there is a kind of a shot where you see a line of people on the snow curving like a serpent, which is very close to what Malraux had already framed in L'Espoir. In fact, Malraux had two great influences. One was the expressionist German cinema, which in fact was very much like the early writings of Malraux, Lune de Papier or Pour une idole à trompe. He had a kind of expressionist tendency in him, which he loved, of course, in Fritz Lang and Murnau and Robert Wiener and so on. And the second influence on him, due, of course, to his political positions, he was a fellow traveler, was the not only the fellow travelers admired Eisenstein and Dovzhenko and Pudovkin, but it was certainly the Russian revolutionary cinema with also its realistic grain.
He was a friend of Eisenstein, wasn't he? At least he worked with Eisenstein a little while.
Yes, Eisenstein had, among the many projects that Eisenstein had the idea of shooting Man's Fate. And so I think that could have been a great film, a missed opportunity.
Originally, Malraux wondered whether films wouldn't actually supersede written fiction. He often asked, why have novels when there are cinema and television? But if that sounded as though he had lost faith in fiction, he also said later that the cinema had grown up without maturing. Perhaps the novel wasn't dead after all. At any rate, he returned to novel writing in the early years of World War II. When the war began, he tried to enlist in the French Air Force, but he was turned down. So he joined a tank regiment. As France fell, he was slightly wounded and captured, but he soon managed to escape. He then seems to have decided, like many other French people, that there was nothing to be done for the time being, and he went back to his books. By now, he was living with Josette Clotis, who gave him 2 sons, and he spent some 2.5 years in the so-called free zone of France, which didn't remain free for long, working on a new novel called The Walnut Trees of Altenburg. Only later did he join the armed resistance, and the delay earned him further criticism from a number of people, including his biographer, Jean Lacouture.
He gave the idea that he was a great man in the resistance, that he was not. In the second part of the war, he was connected with the resistance. After that, he was a fighter, a very brave fighter, at the head of the Brigade Alsace-Lorraine, and that few writers can say so about the war. But in a way, he was a hero, but a tardive hero. He came late.
Oh, that's entirely untrue. I don't mean that he joined the resistance, active resistance, right at the beginning, but he did it long before the brigade was constituted. The more by token that he was arrested and very nearly shot in Toulouse. He started later than some others, but that was only because he wrote his books. He spent, I should say, 2.5 years writing his books, and right after, he started fighting. But he didn't wait until he could wear a uniform.
Maurice Schumann, London's radio spokesman for General de Gaulle and Free France, himself a soldier in the Allied invasion of Normandy, and later de Gaulle's foreign minister. Still, despite Schumann's protest, Malraux's delay in joining the resistance does need some explanation. The best I've heard came from an archive recording of the late Raymond Aron.
He thought that the prospect of liberation were too far ahead, and that it was not worthwhile to begin acting so many years before the real battle. The life of Malraux, as I have known him before the war, was a sort of cycle between periods of action and periods of writings. I'm sure that after the French defeat, his experience as prisoner for a few days or weeks, he was fed up with action, and he wanted to write again. And there is in his personality a sort of dual urge to commit himself to action and to, I will use one of these expressions, to bring to the level of consciousness the maximum human experience. So after the human experience in action, he felt the urge to write it down.
As one can see from his books, André Malraux was haunted by death. Nor did it stalk him only on the page. His grandfather killed himself while cutting wood, perhaps accidentally. His father committed suicide. Josette Clotis, the mother of his 2 sons, was killed in an appalling accident, falling from a train while Malraux was away fighting the Nazis. His 2 younger brothers were both killed. Thing. He married his widowed sister-in-law, Madeleine, and took her son, Alain, into his family, together with his own 2 motherless sons, Gautier and Vincent. Still more tragedy was in store for him, but for several years after the war, he led a relatively calm family life. Relatively. His widow Madeleine agreed that there was always tension between Malraux, the public figure, and André, the very private man. Her piano playing, which he enjoyed, helped him to write, she said. In return, he used to give her the little drawings or doodles that he was fond of making. She used to put them in a scrapbook and has just published them in a book. When did he do them?
At home, at this desk. Anytime, in the restaurant, drawing something.
And did he think that you would publish them? Was that the idea?
No, you think it is your... it's a little thing for your book. Because I collect them in a book, you know?
Yes. They're very funny. And it's an aspect of him that nobody knows.
Completely unknown. And, he has always had a good spirit, funny things.
Did he make you laugh a lot?
Oh, yes, of course.
In conversation?
In conversation, but a sense of humor, very, very dry and sharp and funny.
I was able to confirm that when I went to see a small exhibition of Malraux's drawings. We're standing in a tiny gallery in the Jardin du Palais Royal, the gardens of the Palais Royal, where Colette lived, where Cocteau lived. Still a beautiful place with a fountain playing outside. Right in front of me there's a cat who looks as if he's been blown over by the wind, and tiny cats, tiny devils, all on scraps of paper, and all very charming in a very old-fashioned way. They're strangely sort of 1920s in appearance, the sort of things that Cocteau himself might have done. To the left of that, there's Diable la critique d'art, which, curiously enough, looks very like André Malraux himself, with a sort of lock of hair coming down, 2 very intent eyes, and a sharp nose. So André Malraux could make fun of himself as the great art critic, but could he relax with his family and his sons? I asked his nephew and adopted son, Alain.
He had never wanted to have any children. And his first 2 wives had desperately wanted children with him, maybe to be sure to have something sure and firm and forever from him. So, I mean, this man who had not wanted at all to have not even 1 child had 3 children. But he did not know how to handle things, how to manage things with children. It was not his gift.
Did you love him?
Oh, tremendously.
And did you hate him?
At times, but I mean, that's not so extraordinary. I mean, it happens in all families.
Were you afraid of him?
Oh, we were all scared by him. And he was not, he was not shouting, he was not brutal. We never were beaten or things like that. But we were all scared because he was establishing this sort of distance to protect himself. Always this need of self-defense.
There's a wonderful photograph of Malraux standing with you, and is it Vincent?
No.
It's Gautier.
Yes.
You're on one side and Gautier's on the other. There is Malraux, his head and with a cigarette, looking absolutely like Malraux, the great Malraux. But secretly, his hands, one is holding your ear, I think, and the other one is on the shoulder of Gautier. And you see this, that secretly there's this sort of affection underneath the great public figure. Was he physically affectionate?
No.
No.
No, he was too shy. He was fragile. So he was always trying to escape these human, normal, tender feelings.
By way of illustration, Alain told me an extraordinary story.
We were not even, no, the eldest son was a teenager. I was a boy, I may have been 11 or 12. And it was something quite solemn and pompous from him to let us know that the day after we would have to be at 12 sharp in his room, in his office. So, you know, we were sort of anxious. And when we arrived at 12 sharp in his office, in a rank like in the army, he said to us, I asked the three of you to come because I've said something very important to tell you now. I must let you know that now on, we're not going to kiss each other anymore.
And that was all. It's hard to know what a psychiatrist would make of it. Or perhaps it isn't. What's certain is that in retrospect it looks immensely sad. Only a few years later, both of Malraux's sons were killed in a car crash. Malraux, as usual, hid his private feelings. Parlons d'autre chose. Let's talk about something else, was what he said to one friend just after the tragedy. To another, Michel Ciment, he was more forthcoming.
We were speaking about death and the sense of death. And suddenly, he spoke of his two sons and of the death of two sons, of his sons. And he said, I saw his face completely changing. And he said, when your son dies, you cannot understand a word in this world.
But Alain Malraux sees more in his uncle's reaction than just appalling sorrow.
He's had to go through the worst cases. He didn't want to have children and lost 2 children out of 3 and realized that it did not change completely his life. So the reaction was something which occurred quite later and destroyed him. It was much more a feeling of guilt than grief, I would say.
At that point, surely, the tension between the vulnerable private man and the heroic public mask must have been unbearable. But it would be a mistake to suppose that the first was real and the second, the mask, only a pose. Both were part of Malraux's makeup, and as Olivier Todd points out, he held them together remarkably well.
He hid his private life very carefully. He was very entitled to it. But he tried to make his private person or character or legend coincide with his public image. And in many ways, he succeeded, because we forgive him. We constantly forgive him for his very ambiguous political stances. He had a formidable capacity, as we say in French, to dire tout et le contraire de tout, to say everything and the opposite. He also made some formidable political mistakes. You remember this huge sentence he had under de Gaulle, between the communists and ourselves, there is nothing. Now, it's totally untrue then, but it's perfectly true now. The communists don't exist anymore.
Given that Malraux had worked with the communists in Spain, although he had criticized Stalinism in Moscow, it seemed strange to some people that in later life he rallied so firmly to General de Gaulle and to what some saw as the political right wing. One friend asked Malraux point blank, "Were you ever really a communist?" He answered, "Never." Communism, he said, had been the form of hope, but not hope itself. What he meant, I think, was that communism had been an expedient, a temporary ally against a worse tyranny. It had promised paradise on earth, But that, to Malraux, was an obvious illusion, a promise often made by totalitarian regimes. Paradise, after all, was a matter of metaphysics. Was Malraux, perhaps, an early existentialist? Raymond Aron certainly seemed to think so.
He is interested in human destiny. He is interested in the different ways through which man makes sense of what he is living through. I would say he was an existentialist before the word became fashionable with Sartre.
As early as 1928, in fact, at least 10 years ahead of Jean-Paul Sartre or Albert Camus, Malraux wrote in his novel The Conquerors, "If the world is not absurd, the whole of life is dispersed in vain gestures."
He is the man who pronounced the word absurd for the first time, long time before Camus, who was very much inspired by Malraux, and also some aspects of Sartre come directly from Malraux.
Olivier Todd may be right, but Malraux's thinking went down very badly with Sartre and his circle. Sartre's companion, Simone de Beauvoir, described Malraux's values, with typical dogmatism, as fundamentally erroneous, his view of the world as either childish or odious, and his attitude as either grotesque or scandalous, full of humbug, mystifying notions and concepts. Others might be tempted to apply those words to Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir themselves. But it has to be admitted that some people think they fit the books on art that Malraux spent so much time on after World War II. In works like The Voices of Silence, he spanned the centuries and the continents, bringing together Oriental masks and Picasso portraits, African carvings and medieval European miniatures. He sometimes made mistakes, too, alleging, for instance, that there had been no secular art before the Impressionists. For all that, Malraux's writings about art impressed an expert like Pierre Rosenberg, curator at the Louvre.
He really loved the works of art, and he had a very sensual approach of the works of art. He is perfectly in a sort of tradition that you find very often among French writers to write about art. He is perfectly in the tradition of Diderot, of Baudelaire, or of the Goncourt brothers in a certain way, who were more writers than art historians. Malraux is in a certain way in the same tradition. Many people have thought, in England especially, thought of Malraux as an art historian and as a man of a theory, which I don't think he was at all. I'm speaking of the very severe reviews that Gombrich did on Les Voix du Silence when it came out.
With that in mind, I went to see Professor Sir Ernst Gombrich in his quiet Hampstead home. Had he really been so hard on Malraux?
I think there are, as I believe I also said, many absolutely brilliant aperçus, particularly his insight with which he actually starts about the role of the art book in our time, and the way we respond to these images was very just and revealing. And it is, I think, the response of his generation, which is roughly the generation which discovered Picasso.
It's the same generation as Ezra Pound and T.S. Eliot.
Absolutely.
And other people who ransack the past to make a kind of mosaic of previous works.
Yes, and in a certain sense, even Nietzsche's Birth of Tragedy is of that kind, isn't it?
One coincidence, which may be more than a coincidence, is that when Malraux is talking about the Imaginary Museum, is just the time when the great Skira reproductions are beginning to be diffused, published.
What these art books did was to single out details very often, a hand or something expressive or a face, and of course they completely reinterpreted the work of art. He is a master of this. I'm sure he directed the choice of details, and he completely transforms some very crude and primitive images into immensely expressive modern art. But I think that this is a very widespread view of art, that there's a kind of immediate spark, if you like, which is created and that we can respond to the soul of the Cameroon carver when we look at one of these masks. I'm convinced that this is not so, but it is very widely believed. We may be able to appreciate or feel what it was like to carve this mask, but what it was like to wear this mask, or whether the mask was essentially intended to be humorous or tragic or carnivore, I'm not so sure that we can tell.
So a brilliant amateur would be your final summing up, would it?
Amateur is perhaps not quite the right word. A brilliant prophet, if you like.
Malraux once said, in fact, l'art c'est l'antidestin. Art is the defiance of destiny. He knew, of course, that such defiance was in vain, but the nobility of the gesture was not denied by the fact that it was doomed. That, I think, gives all the more force and pathos to his writing on the subject of death. One whole section of his collected works, now being compiled, consists of funeral orations. On these, French opinion is as divided as on most of his other work. Olivier Todd.
Malraux was a formidable and a very bad public speaker, and certainly when he delivered his extraordinary oraison funèbre of Jean Moulin, the resistance leader at the Panthéon, and I remember listening to these extraordinary long Latin periods full of adjectives. He's the heir of Bossuet and Chateaubriand.
Comprenons bien que pendant les quelques jours où il pourrait encore parler ou écrire, le destin de la résistance est suspendu au courage de cet homme.
Make no mistake, during those few hours when he was still able to speak or to write, the fate of the resistance depended on the courage of that man. As Mademoiselle Moulin has said, he knew everything. Georges Bidault took his place, but already victory had rewarded the silence he had paid for so appallingly. The page of fate was turned. Leader of the resistance, martyred in those blood-stained cellars, turn your dead eyes upon all these black-clad women who are watching over our comrades. They were mourning for France and for you.
Chef de la résistance, martyrisé dans des caves hideuses, regarde de tes yeux disparus toutes ces femmes noires qui veillent nos compagnons. Elles portent le deuil de la France et le tien.
It was inspired. I remember having to pinch myself not to be carried away by it, and thinking that's something you're listening to now, and you should go back and read it tomorrow and see what's left of it.
For once, I agree with Claude Sarraute. Old-fashioned Malraux's oratory may be, but hearing it still sends shivers down my spine. A similarly effective and old-fashioned orator was, of course, General de Gaulle. In some respects, he and Malraux were made for each other. Malraux worshipped heroes, distrusted his old communist allies, and was a sincere French patriot. De Gaulle was still more patriotic, still more suspicious of the communists, and happy to be a hero worshipped. But there was more to it than that. De Gaulle greatly admired Malraux's novel Man's Estate. He found it useful to have in his government a famous man who was in no way committed to the right, and he clearly enjoyed Malraux's company and conversation. He wrote in his memoirs about his cabinet meetings, at which Malraux was present.
On my right, I have and shall always have André Malraux. The presence by my side of this brilliant friend, devotee of great destinies, gives me the feeling that I am thereby saved from the commonplace. The idea that this matchless witness has formed of me helps to give me strength.
Was de Gaulle there, echoing Malraux's own rhetoric, perhaps with a twinkle in his eye? Maurice Schumann, who was also a member of de Gaulle's cabinet, told me how Malraux had performed there.
Remarkably. I remember a discussion on a crucial problem. Was it the right time to devalue the franc once more? He was dead against. But to express his opinion, he argued with financial developments which nobody would have thought he would have been likely to deal with so easily and so fluently. It was an entirely different man, except, of course, when he spoke as a Minister of Culture on cultural problems. And then, of course, we could all realize that nobody else could have taken the positions he took.
The best memorial to that strange near friendship between the novelist and the president is the memoir that Malraux wrote under the title of Les Chênes qu'on abat, a quotation from Victor Hugo, meaning felled oaks rather than fallen oaks, the milder title given to the English translation. The book records what Malraux claims was their last conversation together, but this is a literary artifice. It actually echoes ideas exchanged over many years. And here, too, opinions are divided. Jean-François Revel told me that the book reminded him of the sort of imaginary conversation among the immortals that used to be set for students to invent. Imagine Goethe and Sophocles discussing Shakespeare.
And I think that when I was reading that book, I was thinking, but it's impossible that two people, even prone to generalizations as they were, they would talk during 3 hours only by, philosophical sentences, but always which seems to be extracted from an anthology of quotations, you see.
Jean-François Revel may laugh, but Maurice Schumann, who knew de Gaulle well, thought that the book portrayed him exactly as the general would have wanted to be remembered. In all, Malraux spent about 10 years as de Gaulle's Minister of Cultural Affairs. I asked Claude Sarraute if his impact in that role had seemed to her significant.
Well, I think it's huge, It's something I'll never be grateful enough for, is that he obliged us to clean our buildings. And we discovered behind these black facades beautiful golden stones, which we had no idea had ever existed. And that, I think, is something he should be remembered for.
Another important achievement was to extend musical life in France, to make musical life immensely larger than it had ever been. The number of orchestras, the number of schools, the spreading of musical teaching all over the territory. All that is a very important, all that is a marvelous achievement.
If Maurice Schumann appreciated what Malraux the minister did for music, travellers on the Paris metro enjoyed the fact that at the Louvre station he put on display a number of reproductions of art objects from the Louvre Museum above. And the Louvre curator, Pierre Rosenberg, certainly saw the benefits of Malraux's work.
I'm quite convinced that all what we are able to do now, I mean, the great transformation of the Louvre, the great transformation of the Provincial Museum, all of this would not be possible now if Malraux would not have existed 20 years ago.
But of course, Malraux had not invented the idea of French government backing for the arts. Professor Marc Fumaroli of the Collège de France recently published a polemical book, L'État culturel, the cultural state, in which he takes a frosty view of the whole thing. He traces it back to the French Revolution, using art to glorify the nation-state. Later totalitarian regimes had, of course, played the same game, notably in Hitler's Berlin and Stalin's Moscow. Other critics agree that Malraux should have spent more on libraries, and even some of Malraux's admirers, such as Pierre Rosenberg, are critical of his efforts to set up houses of culture, maisons de la culture, in the provinces. Claude Sarraute has unhappy memories of that particular venture.
At that time, I was critique dramatique. I was theatre critic for Le Monde, and I used to run around in the provinces to all these so-called communist playwrights whose plays were extremely bad, but which were very fashionable at that time. and which were all these playwrights were the children of Brecht, you know. And it was supposed to be for the working class. Of course, there was never a single worker there. I mean, you know, it was all bourgeois and intellectuals who went there. I thought the whole idea of Malraux, as far as culture went, was wrong.
Here again, though, there's something to be said for Malraux. Pace Professor Fumaroli, he wasn't simply promoting pro-government propaganda. He actually defended subversive writers like Jean Genet, controversial filmmakers like Nico Papatakis, and Henri Alleg's denunciation of French torture in Algeria, La Question. Michel Ciment, as a film critic, pointed out one particular way in which André Malraux helped French cinema.
He created in 1960 the famous Avance sur recette, which is still going on 30 years after, and which is the main reason why the French cinema is still the most, probably the only really vital cinema in Europe. Yes, the idea of the Avance sur recette is to take some money at the box office. That is, every time you see any film, but also, of course, Rambo, for instance, or Terminator 2, all these big American films which drew a lot of money, the state on each ticket sold, on every film being shown in France, is taking from 0.5% or 1% of the receipts at the box office and put them into a collective fund which is run by the state and redistributed to help every year about 30 films, either beginners or ambitious films of artistic ambition that are going to make really the wealth of French cinema.
But on one famous occasion, Malraux did manage to annoy France's film establishment. This was when he clashed with the late Henri Langlois, the untidy genius who had founded France's great film library, the Cinémathèque. I remember Langlois showing me round it, a shaggy bear of a man shambling round the trophies in his den. He'd saved innumerable film classics. It was at the Cinémathèque just after the war that I first saw Malraux's film of L'Espoir with an introduction by Maurice Schumann. But Langlois was no administrator, and under his reign the Cinémathèque, 95% state-funded, was getting out of hand. So Malraux put in an outside manager, and French film enthusiasts were up in arms. Among them was Michel Ciment, who admired Langlois, but saw his faults.
On the other hand, about Malraux, I don't know. I, though we are not on the same political side, I mean, I was not a Gaullist, I always kept a strong admiration for Malraux. I think that on the whole he was very faithful to his ideals. I mean, after all, it's the opposite of Sartre, who always spoke but did little action. But Malraux was always there when action was needed. He was there during the Spanish Civil War, he was there in the Resistance, and he even fought against torture in Algeria. So I think on the whole his commitments are pretty coherent.
And with that, I think I agree. Despite the apparent contradictions in his character and his life, a common thread does run through André Malraux's achievements. And he was very much a representative of his century, especially in France. In Britain, writer-adventurers are less common and somehow suspect. One thinks of T.E. Lawrence, whom Malraux much admired. Writers who become ministers are rarer still. Real writers, that is. There I can think only of Churchill and Disraeli, but you see how far-fetched the comparisons are. Malraux was an intellectual impatient with inaction, a bohemian once contemptuous of convention, an idealist disillusioned by the so-called extreme left, an aesthete well aware of the limitations of art. He wrote at least 2 lasting novels, Man's Estate and Days of Hope. He fought bravely in Spain and in the later days of World War II. He wrote eloquently about art and opened the eyes of his readers. He cleaned the face of Paris and promoted French culture. If he had been Britain's Minister of Culture, there might still have been a British film industry today. Above all, he was a man of courage in the face of death. In The Voices of Silence, there is one famous passage which I think sums up his sense of tragedy and the stoicism with which he met it.
Nietzsche wrote that in the face of a field of spring flowers, the feeling that all humanity is only a similar luxuriance, created for no purpose by some blind power, if that feeling were truly felt, it could not be borne. Perhaps.
That last word, perhaps, is Malraux's personal proviso. He, too, had looked into the void that Nietzsche found so terrible and decided that, yes, it might nonetheless be born. Perhaps. And that last equivocal word could also serve as an epitaph for so deeply equivocal a man.
Nietzsche a écrit qu'en face de la floraison d'une prairie au printemps, le sentiment que l'humanité tout entière n'était qu'une semblable luxuriance créée pour le néant par quelque puissance aveugle, s'il était un sentiment réellement éprouvé, ne pouvait être supporté. Peut-être.
André Malraux, The Man and the Mask, was written and presented by Richard Mayne. The reader was John Moffatt, and the producer, Judith Bumpus.